Most of y'all should be able to see the notes at this point. Okay, so ATP and the need for energy. Your body needs energy. It has to have energy to do certain things. Mm. And some of them we talked about recently, like active transport. In your cell, the molecule of energy is ATP. Now, we've talked about glucose being energy before. You can see that written over here. Glucose, which is sugar, and it has a carbohydrate, has the chemical formula C6H12O6. It is a chemical energy. It's a type of chemical energy, but it's not the energy that the cell needs. The cell needs ATP. It's like, hey, you've got US dollars, but you're in Great Britain, right? When I went to England, right? I went to England a couple years ago. I had to convert my money to British pounds. When I went to China, I had to get Chinese RMB, and I even still have some in my wallet. When I went to Barcelona, I had to convert US dollars to euros. So it's like when you're in a certain place, there's a certain currency, and it's the money that makes the world go round. Same thing. When you're in a cell, yeah, your cells take in glucose, but it uses that glucose and converts it to ATP, which is the currency of the cell. You have to have ATP. Now, what does the cell need energy for? Oh, well, excuse me. In a cell, the molecule of energy is called ATP, and you do need to know that ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. All right, because sometimes on the test, they'll list adenosine triphosphate as an answer choice, and they expect that you know that that means ATP, and that is the molecule of energy in a cell, right? Now, the chemical energy in all, well, no matter what kind of organism you are, plant or animal, that chemical energy that you have, glucose, ends up being converted into ATP. The only difference is how we get our glucose, okay, or how we obtain our glucose or get it in our body. Now, some things in a cell that require energy, obviously active transport. We talked about that the other day in cell transport. Anytime you move something from low to high concentration or against the concentration gradient, it does require energy or ATP. Some examples that we talked about were obviously endocytosis and exocytosis, moving large particles in or out of a cell. But I also mentioned that sodium-potassium pump. Anytime you're pumping anything, pumping up a bicycle tire, a basketball, soccer ball, whatever, that requires energy, right? It takes energy for you to do that. And the sodium potassium pump, that's done when your muscles are contracting and doing work. Your muscle cells constantly pump sodium out of your muscle cells. That's why your sweat tastes salty. And you're constantly pumping potassium in so that you don't end up with a bunch of muscle cramps. Right? Now, your body also needs energy for things like mitosis and general cell metabolism. But another thing that I mentioned that was an example of active transport that requires ATP was how plant roots, right? They're constantly uptaking nutrients from the soil, right? And in the roots, there's already a greater concentration of nutrients than there is in the soil. It's more concentrated, it's more dense, if that makes sense. It's more the number of nutrients is just greater in the roots because it's been taking up all those nutrients. So anyway, it continues to do that. It continues to move it from low concentration of nutrients in the soil to high concentration in the roots. That is an example also of active transport, and it requires ATP. All right, now, see, obviously there was something going on with soccer. I don't know. We must have lost 0-2, and I was pissed off. I don't know. Now, ATP and its role in how it gives the cell energy, right? That's what these next couple of slides are about. You'll find out about something called the ATP cycle. Now, what you see on the board or on the presentation is a molecule of ATP. It's basically, this is just a general image. It contains an adenosine molecule connected to a 5-sided sugar, and then it has 3 phosphate groups attached. Now, anytime anything is attached to something else in chemistry or in molecules, it requires a chemical bond, right? So these yellow lines between these phosphates are called chemical bonds. And since each one of these phosphates has a negative charge, that's what those red lines mean, they repel each other, kind of like magnets. If you take positive ends of a magnet and try to put them together, they'll push apart from each other, right? Y'all might have played with magnets before when you were little and just push one magnet towards the other and watch the other one jump away. I don't know, maybe I was just a bored child. But that, maybe some of y'all did that too. But anyway, to hold those things together, like these 2 or 3 negatively charged phosphate groups, it requires a certain amount of energy for you to hold it together. So anytime you have this third phosphate attached, there is a lot of energy stored in these chemical bonds. And that is how ATP stores energy, in its chemical bonds. And that's how it stores energy. Well, the question is how does it release energy? Well, you'll constantly, in this thing called an ATP ADP cycle, you'll constantly go back and forth between being a charged battery and a dead battery, an ATP molecule and an ADP molecule. ADP means it's your dead battery. Actually, ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. And you'll see that down here, it only has 2 phosphate groups attached. Di is a prefix that means 2. Oh, excuse me, that Pepsi's getting to me. So anyway, you got this ATP, energy is stored in the chemical bonds. And what you do to release energy is you break that chemical bond. You remove that phosphate group. It becomes a free floating phosphate group in your cell. It's just floating around out there. And energy is released. And that's how you get energy out of ATP, right? Well, now that these molecules don't die, they don't disappear, they're not destroyed. They're like enzymes. Once you use them one time, you can use them again, right? So same thing with this ADP molecule now and this free-floating phosphate. For me to get this dead battery back charged, which is in this state, somehow I've got to add that third phosphate back. What your body will do is it'll take in this ADP molecule and that phosphate group, and it'll move into a cell organelle called a mitochondria, right? That mitochondria takes in glucose and oxygen because it's about to do cellular respiration, which is what animals do. It takes in that glucose and oxygen, does cellular respiration, and it'll convert that ADP back into an ATP molecule. All right, so that's actually what's occurring there. And that's how organisms get ATP. Matter of fact, that's why they call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell, because it's constantly producing the molecules of energy, ATP. Right? This is something else for another section. Now, what this slide compares, right? And it's at the end of the day, whether you are an animal or a plant, and just FYI, these are animal cells and this is a plant cell. Whether you're an animal or a plant, somehow you got to get glucose, because that glucose is what you use to make ATP, right? I mean, whether you're a plant or an animal, you got to have ATP. So with that being said, ATP is made by a mitochondria. So I want you to know that a mitochondria is in both plant and animal cells, because both have to have ATP. So you both have to be able to take in glucose, do cellular respiration, and make ATP. So both have to have a mitochondria. The difference is how you obtain your glucose. If you're an animal, you're made up of these animal cells. And what happens is you eat something, you consume it, right? Like, for example, just say I ate a Snickers bar. My stomach digests it. It breaks it down into all these small molecules. These molecules and nutrients are absorbed by my large and small intestines. It then gets into my bloodstream, and my concentration of sugar in my bloodstream gets very, very high, which is outside the cell. And the concentration is obviously low inside the cell because I don't have a lot of energy. And that glucose will diffuse into my cell. It will go from high concentration to low concentration, and then end up moving into a mitochondria where it will make ATP. So if you're an animal, you consume to get your glucose. If you are a plant, then what you do is you use a chloroplast, which converts sunlight energy into a chemical energy, right? You actually make your own glucose. That's why they're called producers. And then that glucose just trickles down into a mitochondria, where that mitochondria will convert that glucose into ATP, which is the molecule of energy needed for all cells, whether or not you are an animal or a plant. Right? So hopefully y'all understand some of this stuff. And apparently there was a test at one point in time, but we're not going to worry about that right now, because obviously y'all hadn't covered mitosis. So we're not going to study that for now, but it eventually will be coming up.